It was an ordinary day of the school, until one student found himself caught in an unusual and frustrating predicament. He had been innocently sitting in class when a teacher, in an attempt to discipline him for a minor classroom disruption, decided to teach him a lesson. The teacher, frustrated by the student's behavior, thought it would be funny to put glue in his hair as a consequence. She believed it was harmless, a little joke that would make him think twice before acting out again. But little did she know, this wasn't just any student. His father, a man with influence and a reputation for protecting his family, held a position that could make this seemingly trivial situation go very wrong for her. As the teacher watched the child struggle with his sticky hair, she had no idea that her playful punishment was about to spiral into something far more serious. The student, with a look of shock on his face, immediately ran home after school, desperate to tell his parents. He wasn't sure how to handle what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: his father was going to hear about it. What would happen next? Would the teacher face the consequences of her actions, or was this just the beginning of a much bigger confrontation? The tension was rising, and everything was about to change. The moment the student stepped through the door, his heart was still racing. His mom, busy preparing dinner in the kitchen, didn't immediately notice the expression on his face, but when she looked up, her smile quickly faded. She could see that something was wrong. "What happened? You look upset," she asked, walking over to him. He didn't answer right away. His eyes glanced down at the ground, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his young shoulders. He opened his mouth to speak but then closed it again, unsure how to put the frustration and confusion into words. Finally, he looked up at his mother, who was waiting patiently. "It's Mrs. Brown. She put glue in my hair," he said, his voice shaking slightly. His mother's face froze, a mixture of disbelief and concern flashing across her face. "Glue? What do you mean, she put glue in your hair?" She said it was for being loud in class, but I didn't even do anything that bad." His voice began to rise, frustration creeping in. "It's all sticky, Mom. I can't even get it out." His mother's hands trembled as she placed the spoon she'd been holding onto the counter. Her thoughts raced, and she glanced out the window, as though searching for an answer in the quiet evening outside. She took a deep breath and looked back at her son, her face softening. "Let me see," she said gently, leading him to the bathroom. As she inspected the damage, she couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. The glue had dried, making the task of removing it seem impossible. She tried to stay calm, but inside, her mind was already racing. How could a teacher go so far as to humiliate a student like this? And why hadn't the teacher handled the situation differently? Her son's distress made it clear that this wasn't just a small issue. It wasn't about the glue in his hair. It was about the feeling of being targeted, of being treated unfairly. And she knew that, as his parent, she had to act. She tried calling the school, but it was after hours, and no one picked up. Her frustration grew. What could she do? The whole situation seemed so out of hand. She wanted answers, and she wanted them quickly. But she also knew that she couldn't let the matter go, no matter how difficult it would be to confront the school. Meanwhile, her son had retreated to his room, his mind a whirlpool of emotions. He'd always been a quiet, reserved child, never one to cause trouble. His teachers loved him for his work ethic, and his classmates admired him for his kindness. But today, something had snapped. This teacher, Mrs. Brown, had pushed him to his breaking point. The memory of the glue, how it had stuck to his hair, felt like a badge of shame. As he sat on his bed, his phone in hand, his thumb hovered over the contacts list. He thought about calling his dad. His dad, a no-nonsense kind of man, would know what to do. But it wasn't just that. There was something about his dad that made people listen. He had a way of commanding respect, and his job in the community meant that when something like this happened, it wasn't just a personal matter. It could turn into something much bigger. His dad had always told him to stand up for himself, to never let anyone walk over him. But this was different. How could he fight back against someone in a position of authority? How could he prove that what Mrs. Brown did wasn't just an accident? It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. At that moment, he made a decision. He was going to call his dad. He needed him. As the phone rang, the student tried to push the nerves out of his chest. He had no idea how his father would react, but he knew one thing. He would take this seriously. The phone clicked, and his father's voice came through. "Hey, champ, what's up?" His dad's voice was warm but firm, always grounding. "Dad, something happened today at school." The student began, his voice shaking slightly. I don't know how to say this, but Mrs. Brown, my teacher, she put glue in my hair. I don't know why she did it, but I need your help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. His father didn't speak right away. The silence seemed to stretch on for what felt like forever. "Glue in your hair," his dad repeated, his tone suddenly much more serious. "Are you hurt?" "No," the student replied quickly. It's stuck in my hair, and I don't know how to get it out." "Okay, we'll figure it out," his dad said, his voice more controlled now. "But that's not what I'm worried about." "Why did she do that?" "I don't know, Dad. I didn't do anything that bad. I was just talking a little bit with my friend, and she said I was being disruptive. Then she just glued my hair. And I don't think she realized how much trouble she was causing." His father took a deep breath. "Listen, kid, we're going to get to the bottom of this. I want you to stay calm. We'll handle this the right way, okay?" His father's words, always so reassuring, helped him feel a little better, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end easily. He knew his dad wouldn't just let this go, but he also knew that sometimes standing up for what's right could mean making enemies. Would the school back down, or would they try to cover it up? The next morning, his father walked into the school with a look of determination on his face. The student, standing by his side, couldn't help but feel a surge of both anxiety and relief. This wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. His father wasn't just any parent. He was someone who had a voice, someone who had influence in the community. They made their way to the principal's office, where they were greeted by a stern-looking woman in her mid-40s. She offered them a polite smile, but said nothing as they took a seat. His father wasted no time. "I'm here to discuss an incident involving my son," he began. "Yesterday, he was subjected to inappropriate treatment by a teacher, and I need to understand why this was allowed to happen." The principal shifted in her chair, her expression growing tense. She had expected a conversation about an academic issue, not something like this. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied cautiously. "My son was physically harmed by a teacher," his father said, his tone sharper now. "She put glue in his hair. I need to know what happened, and I need answers." The room fell silent. The principal's face flushed, and the tension in the air thickened. She opened her mouth to speak but seemed to hesitate, caught off guard by the seriousness of the situation. As his father stared at her, his son felt a wave of unease. Would the truth finally come to light? Or was this just the beginning of a battle neither of them were prepared for? The principal's silence stretched longer than either of them expected. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, but there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. Her professional mask had slipped, and something darker seemed to lurk beneath the surface. She glanced at the door, then back at the father and son, her hands fidgeting on the desk as if looking for something to hold on to. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," the principal said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm not aware of any such incident with your son. We have strict policies in place when it comes to discipline, and—" His father leaned forward in his chair, his posture now rigid. "Strict policies," he repeated, his voice cold but steady. "You mean to tell me you don't know that one of your teachers, who's supposed to protect and educate children, physically harmed my son, and now you're trying to pass it off as a misunderstanding?" The principal opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. It was clear she hadn't anticipated such an aggressive response. She hesitated again, before shifting her eyes to the paperwork on her desk, as though searching for an answer she could use. But there was nothing. No report. No documentation of the incident. Her body language, the way she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, gave her away. She had no defense. "I'll get to the bottom of this," she said after a moment, a bit too quickly. "We will review the situation, and I'll speak with Mrs. Brown. It could just be a case of miscommunication, a simple mistake." The father's gaze narrowed. "Miscommunication," he repeated, the anger in his voice barely contained. "My son didn't make any mistake. He was treated like an object of ridicule. You want to call it a misunderstanding, but there's no denying the facts here. Glue in his hair. Do you really think that's just a simple mistake?" The principal's hands trembled slightly, and she glanced down at her desk again, almost as if she was avoiding his eyes. But it didn't go unnoticed. The father had been in enough confrontations to know when someone was hiding the truth, and this woman was doing everything she could to deflect the responsibility. Her words were just empty phrases now, a desperate attempt to avoid facing the reality of the situation. "I understand that this is upsetting for you," she said, her tone a bit too rehearsed now. "But these things take time. We'll need to speak with other witnesses, gather all the facts before making any decisions." The father stood abruptly, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor loud in the tense silence of the room. His voice lowered, but it was clear he wasn't backing down. "I don't think you understand at all. I'm not going to wait for time. My son is hurt. He's humiliated, and I'm not leaving here until this is addressed properly." The principal stiffened, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Her gaze flickered to the door again, and the unease in the room grew thicker, almost suffocating. But just as the silence was about to become unbearable, the door to her office opened without warning. A figure stepped inside. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable uniform of a school security officer. His eyes immediately locked with the principal's, and there was something in his expression that made the hairs on the back of the student's neck stand up. "Everything okay in here?" the security officer asked, his voice low, almost casual. The principal hesitated before replying, her voice soft. "Yes, everything's fine. Thank you. Just discussing a small issue with a parent." But the father wasn't fooled. He knew that the security officer's sudden appearance wasn't coincidental. This was no longer a simple parent-teacher discussion. It was a power play. The school was trying to intimidate him, to force him to back down. He wasn't about to let that happen. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm taking this further if I have to. You'll hear from my lawyer." The principal's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words faltered. The security officer, sensing the tension, moved slightly toward the door, his hand resting just near the edge of his radio. His presence made it clear that he was there to enforce the school's will, not to solve any problems. It was a silent threat. The father didn't flinch. He stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. His son, sitting quietly beside him, could feel the weight of the moment. His father was fighting for him, and yet, in the back of his mind, doubts began to creep in. What if the school didn't listen? What if they just swept it all under the rug? What if no one believed them? His stomach twisted at the thought. There was a brief exchange of glances between the principal and the security officer, and for a moment, it seemed like they were having a conversation without speaking at all. The principal's eyes flicked to the student's father, and then back to the door as if she was trying to decide whether to escalate the situation or find a way to placate them. Finally, the principal cleared her throat, her voice slightly more strained. "Look, I understand that you're upset," she said, her tone softening, as if trying to regain some control of the conversation. "But there's a process we have to follow. We can't just jump to conclusions based on a single accusation. You'll need to give us some time." The father's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond right away. He could feel the tension in the room thickening, like a storm about to break. The school was trying to control the narrative, to make him believe that they were doing everything they could. But he wasn't convinced. Not for a second. His son's humiliation couldn't be swept under the rug, no matter how much they wanted it to be. Time, he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. You've had time. You've had all the time you need to deal with this. But now we're going to do this my way. The principal visibly stiffened, but there was nothing she could do to stop the inevitable. Her eyes flicked to the security officer once again, but this time the officer didn't step forward. He stood still, as if waiting for orders that weren't coming. Get the teacher here, the father demanded. Now, there was a moment of hesitation. The principal's face twisted with uncertainty, but she finally nodded. Fine. I'll have Mrs. Brown brought in. As she reached for the phone, the father felt a surge of anticipation. He knew the confrontation was coming to a head, and soon he would have the answers he had been demanding. But even as he prepared for the final confrontation, a part of him wondered how far the school would go to protect one of their own. Would they side with him? Or would this just become another battle lost to bureaucracy and red tape? The air felt thick, charged with the electricity of the moment. Something had to give, and it was about to. The principal dialed the number slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed the buttons. The father stood still, watching her with a keen eye, as though daring her to try and avoid confronting the teacher who had caused all of this chaos. He wasn't going to leave without answers, no matter how much she tried to stall. As the phone rang, the silence in the room grew thicker, wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. The security officer remained near the door, his eyes on the father, but there was a shift in his posture, a hint of unease that hadn't been there before. It wasn't clear if it was the tension in the room or something else, but it felt like everyone was waiting for something to snap. The principal finally spoke when the phone picked up. Mrs. Brown, she said, her voice tight, we need to see you in my office immediately. There's been an incident with one of your students. A long pause followed before the voice on the other end responded. I'm a bit tied up right now, actually. Can it wait? Mrs. Brown's voice was smooth and calm, almost unnervingly so. There was no hint of concern, no apology, just a detached professionalism that made the father's stomach churn. No, it can't wait, the principal replied firmly, her own voice gaining a slight edge. You need to come to my office right now. After a few more exchanged words, the principal hung up the phone, her face betraying a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. She looked at the father, her hands resting nervously on the desk. She'll be here soon, the principal said, her voice now barely above a whisper. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity as the father, standing tall and unmoving, waited for the inevitable confrontation. His son, sitting beside him, shifted uneasily in his seat. His mind kept running through the events of the previous day, trying to make sense of what had happened. He still couldn't understand how a teacher, someone who was supposed to care for him, could have done something so cruel, so degrading. And now, here they were, facing the person responsible for his humiliation. What was Mrs. Brown going to say? How would she explain herself? The door opened a few minutes later, and Mrs. Brown stepped into the room. She was a tall woman, her posture perfect, her face expressionless. She looked as though she had been prepared for this moment, as though she knew it was coming but wasn't at all worried. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the father and his son with a quick glance before she turned her gaze to the principal, her lips curling into a tight, professional smile. Good afternoon, she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. I understand there's been some sort of issue. The father stood up from his chair, his fists clenched by his sides. You know exactly what the issue is, he said, his voice low and steady, but with a noticeable edge. You put glue in my son's hair. I want to know why you thought that was okay. Mrs. Brown didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze coolly. I've been teaching for over 15 years, she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "And in all that time, I've never had a student complain about discipline. I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. I applied a bit of glue, yes, but only as a harmless way to get his attention. It's a method I've used before." The father's jaw clenched tighter, and he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "A harmless way to get his attention. You humiliated him in front of the class. That's not discipline. That's abuse." Mrs. Brown raised an eyebrow, as though his words didn't faze her in the slightest. She glanced at the principal, whose face had gone pale, before turning back to the father. "You're overreacting," she said calmly. "It was a minor incident. Nothing more." The father took another step forward, his voice now sharp. "You don't get it, do you? My son isn't some toy you can play with. You don't get to treat him like that and brush it off as a harmless prank." Just as the room seemed to reach its boiling point, the principal spoke up, her voice wavering. "Perhaps we should all just take a breath and—" Before she could finish, a loud bang sounded from the hallway. The door to the office swung open once more, and a figure stepped inside, interrupting the tense conversation. It was another man, this one dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. Everyone in the room froze. The father's eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, clearly caught off guard by the appearance of the stranger. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Mrs. Brown, then back to the father. "I'm here because I believe you've been misinformed," he said calmly, his voice like ice. "I'm here to help clear things up." The father's pulse quickened. Something about the man's presence felt wrong, unsettling. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm an investigator," he replied, "and I have been hired to look into the incident involving your son." The room went silent, each person processing his words. The father felt a knot tighten in his stomach. An investigator. What did this mean? And why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? An investigator. The principal repeated, her voice trembling slightly. I wasn't told anything about an investigation." The investigator, who hadn't taken his eyes off the father, stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate. "I'm sure you weren't, but it's been decided that this case needs to be handled differently, officially. I'm here to take charge now." The air seemed to grow heavier, and the father could feel his grip on the situation slipping. What was happening here? Why had an investigator been brought in so suddenly? Was this some sort of power play? His mind raced, but he didn't have time to sort through the confusion before the investigator spoke again. "I've reviewed the situation," he said coolly, "and there are things that you, sir, are not aware of. Things that would change your perspective on what happened with your son." His words hung in the air, charged with a hidden threat. The father's heart began to pound in his chest. What was the investigator talking about? Was there more to this than just a teacher's bad decision? And why had the principal looked so nervous when the man entered the room? Before he could process everything, Mrs. Brown spoke up, her voice shaky. I didn't think it would go this far," she muttered, barely audible. "What do you mean?" the father demanded, turning to her with a sharp look. "What's going on here?" The investigator remained quiet, his face unreadable, while Mrs. Brown, now visibly sweating, seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. The principal, who had been silent through most of this, exchanged a glance with the investigator, her face pale. "I think we should sit down," the investigator said, his voice cold, calculating. "There's a lot more to this story than you realize." The father's mind was spinning. What had he just walked into? This wasn't just about a teacher's careless mistake anymore. There were secrets here, hidden truths that threatened to destroy everything he thought he knew. And with each passing second, the tension in the room grew thicker, the stakes higher, and the truth more elusive than ever before. The investigator's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. The father's confusion only grew as the seconds ticked by. What was he talking about? What was really going on here? He wanted answers, wanted to understand, but the more he heard, the deeper the mystery became. He stood there for a moment, eyeing the investigator, who was now quietly watching him, waiting for him to speak. The principal, who had barely said a word since the investigator's arrival, was sitting at her desk, her hands trembling as she clutched a pen. Mrs. Brown looked like she wanted to disappear, her eyes darting between the father and the investigator. But she said nothing. "Enough of these games," the father finally said, his voice firm. "I want the truth. Now." The investigator didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped toward the desk and set down a folder, pushing it toward the father. "This is what you've been asking for," he said, his voice low, controlled. "The full picture, the facts." The father hesitated, glancing at the folder, then back at the investigator. Something about this felt wrong. He'd been asking for the truth, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Still, there was no turning back now. He opened the folder, his heart pounding in his chest. The first page he saw was a series of documents, handwritten notes, and a school disciplinary report. It was all standard at first, until his eyes fell on a name. Mrs. Brown. His stomach twisted. The report was dated just a few days before the incident with his son. The file seemed to detail behavioral problems, not his son's, but Mrs. Brown's. There were multiple complaints filed against her from other teachers, staff, and even students. Her temper, her harsh methods of discipline, and several instances where her behavior had crossed a line. But it wasn't just the complaints that made his blood run cold. It was the pattern that began to emerge as he flipped through the pages. This wasn't a simple case of an overzealous teacher making a mistake. No, there was something darker at play here. Mrs. Brown had been reprimanded multiple times before, but each time, the incidents had been swept under the rug. The reports mentioned how some parents had tried to push for an investigation into her conduct, but each time, the school had blocked it, either by offering settlements or claiming that the claims were unfounded. The father's hands shook as he read. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been right. The school wasn't just trying to protect one teacher. They were trying to protect themselves. The investigator's voice cut through the silence. "What you don't know, Mr. Harris, is that this isn't the first time Mrs. Brown has been involved in something like this. We've been quietly investigating her for months. Your son was just the latest victim." The father looked up, his eyes wild with disbelief. "You're telling me this has happened before, and you let her stay here?" "You?" "Yes," the investigator interrupted. "We let her stay. And now it's too late to go back. But your son, he was the one who finally forced our hand." He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto the father's. "We weren't going to do anything about it. The school was going to sweep it all under the rug. But your son's case, it's different. He's the one who gave us the push we needed." The father's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The anger burned inside him, but so did a sense of betrayal. He had been fighting for justice, but it seemed the whole system was stacked against him. The investigator was telling him things he hadn't wanted to hear, things that made him question everything. The teacher he thought was the villain, the one who had humiliated his son, was part of something far bigger, far more sinister. The entire school system had failed his son, and now, it seemed, they were trying to cover up their own complicity. "So what happens now?" the father asked, his voice low, filled with a mix of anger and confusion. "We will expose her," the investigator said. "This time, we won't let her off the hook. We've gathered enough evidence to finally hold her accountable." The principal's face had gone completely pale by now. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting from the investigator to the father. Her silence spoke volumes. The father turned to her, his voice rising with fury. "You knew about all of this, didn't you? You knew, and you still let her keep teaching. You still let her ruin kids' lives. How can you live with yourself?" The principal looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, It seemed like she was about to say something. But then, the words never came. She just looked defeated, a shell of the confident woman who had tried to control the conversation earlier. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The father's fists were clenched so tight, his knuckles were white. He wanted to lash out, to scream, but he forced himself to hold it together. His son, sitting beside him, was silent as well, his eyes wide, still processing the enormity of what was unfolding. It wasn't just about the glue in his hair anymore. It was about everything that had been hidden, about the system that was supposed to protect them, but had failed them instead. "I'm done with this," the father said finally, standing up from his chair. "I'm taking this to the media, to every news station, every outlet. You can't cover this up anymore." The investigator didn't respond right away, but then he smiled. A slow, almost pitying smile. "I'm afraid you won't be able to do that," he said. The father froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" The investigator stood, moving slowly toward the door. "You won't be able to take it to the media because—" He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. "Because it's already out there." Before the father could react, the door swung open again, and another figure stepped inside. It was a woman, holding a tablet. Her eyes met the father's, and her face was unreadable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice cold. "But I'm afraid the media already knows. Everything you've been told is about to go public. It's already in the hands of a few reporters." The father's mind raced, but the twist wasn't over yet. The woman lifted the tablet, showing a news headline. "School scandal exposed. Teacher accused of abuse, system complicit." The shock hit him like a tidal wave, but it wasn't just the exposure that stunned him. The woman's next words would cut through everything he thought he knew. "We've been waiting for you to act, Mr. Harris. But now, you're just another part of the story." The father's mind reeled as the woman's words sank in. His heart pounded against his chest, his breath shallow as the weight of the situation hit him all at once. Everything he'd worked for, every phone call, every confrontation, every sleepless night, had led to this moment, but it wasn't what he'd expected. The investigator and the woman exchanged a look, as if confirming something between them. Then the woman turned to the father, her expression unreadable. "You've been part of this story from the beginning," she said. "You just didn't realize it." The father took a step back, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. "What do you mean? How could I be part of it?" "The school knew about the incidents before you even stepped in." The investigator chimed in, his voice calm, almost detached. "But they couldn't let this get out without it damaging their reputation. So they used your son's case to create the right conditions. They needed someone to make noise, someone who would push the story to the forefront." The pieces began to fall into place, but it didn't make any sense. The father's thoughts were jumbled. Had they been manipulating him all along? Had the school planned this? Was his son's suffering part of some twisted game to expose the flaws in the system? His stomach twisted, and a wave of anger surged through him again. "Are you telling me this was all set up?" he demanded, his voice rising. "My son was just a pawn in your little game." "No," the woman said quickly, shaking her head. "Not a pawn. Just the catalyst. We needed a victim, someone who wouldn't be ignored, someone whose voice would resonate. Why didn't you just expose this yourself?" The father snapped, his frustration growing. "Why involve us? Why drag my son into this?" The woman's gaze softened, though her face remained calm. "It wasn't about dragging your son into anything," she explained gently. "It was about giving him a chance to be heard, to make sure that the school's actions didn't remain hidden. You were the right person to fight back, Mr. Harris. Your determination, it was the spark we needed." The father's anger began to fade, replaced by a complex mix of emotions. Confusion, betrayal, and disbelief. His mind tried to come to terms with it all, but there was one thing that remained crystal clear. His son's voice had been the one to make a difference. Without that single moment, without his son's experience, none of this would have come to light. The investigator stood still, watching the father as he processed the information. The principal, who had been silent throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted it to go this far. I didn't know what to do. We all knew something was wrong, but no one had the guts to act." The father turned to her, his expression hardening. "You knew, and you let it continue. You let it happen to my son, to other kids, and you sat back while all of this unfolded. You're as guilty as she is." The principal's face turned crimson, and she swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. It was clear that her guilt weighed heavily on her, but there was no redemption now, no way to undo the harm that had been caused. "Don't worry about her," the investigator said, his voice cutting through the tension. "She'll be dealt with. We'll make sure of that. But this isn't about her anymore." The father nodded, his eyes still burning with anger, but now with a sense of closure. He had come into this fight thinking it was all about justice for his son, but now he understood that it was much bigger than that. It wasn't just about exposing one teacher's misdeeds. It was about shedding light on a system that had been allowing harm to go unnoticed for far too long. His son had been the catalyst, but this story was about so much more. The woman glanced at the tablet again, and then at the father. "The truth is already out there. The media is running with it. This isn't just a local scandal anymore. The world is watching." The father's eyes flickered to the screen, where the headlines were already shifting to larger stories. His son's name, his son's face, was now part of the narrative. But it wasn't just a story of abuse. It was a story of resistance, of a system being forced to confront its own failures. The father felt a strange sense of relief, though it was bittersweet. He had fought hard for this, but at what cost? His son had suffered, and the scars would remain. But at least in the end, his son's voice had been heard, and the school's secrets had been dragged into the light. "Thank you," the father said to the investigator, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for doing the right thing." The investigator nodded, his expression unchanged. "It was never about doing the right thing, Mr. Harris. It was always about making sure the truth came to light. Your son made sure of that." The father looked at his son, who had been silent through it all, his eyes wide as he processed everything that had happened. He wasn't sure if his son fully understood yet the impact his actions would have, but he knew one thing. His son had changed the game. And that made all the difference. As the meeting came to a close, the principal left the room quietly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Mrs. Brown was already being escorted out by the security officer, her face pale with fear and shame. The father and his son stood in the center of the room, the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to settle. The investigator gave them a curt nod before leaving, his footsteps fading down the hall. But as the door closed behind him, the father felt a sense of finality. This wasn't just the end of a story, it was the beginning of something bigger. His son had been a catalyst for change, and while the road ahead would still be difficult, at least they now knew the truth. They had fought the system, and they had won. The school would be forced to answer for its actions, and the world, for once, would be paying attention. For the first time in a long while, the father allowed himself to feel a small sense of peace. His son had shown him what it meant to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And together, they had brought light to a dark place. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. One that, hopefully, would protect future generations from suffering in silence. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.